It's already 2026. We're 9 months out from the midterms, 9 months. And instead of talking about jobs or schools or healthcare, we're watching a former president maneuver to tighten his grip on the very machinery of our elections. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because this didn't start with some dramatic moment. It started with fear, a very specific fear, losing the House, losing the Senate, and what that loss might trigger. He said it out loud more than once. If Republicans don't win, they'll find a reason to impeach him. He believes that. And here's the thing, he may not be wrong about the political math, but the obsession isn't about policy. It's not about advancing an agenda. It's about survival, personal survival, historical survival, legacy. There's something almost singular about the focus. Keep Congress at any cost, not to pass legislation, not to build coalitions, just to prevent accountability. And when someone is that fixated on control, you start to notice what they're willing to bend to keep it. The irony is almost unbearable. The call he spent his entire second term railing against. The outcome he labeled a witch hunt, a coup, an attack on democracy. The thing he insisted could never happen, it happened. The United States Senate voted 68-32 to convict Donald Trump on impeachment charges, 68-32. For the first time in American history, a president was removed through impeachment, not speculation, not punditry, not a warning about the future, the clerk reading the roll, the gavel coming down, final, and Washington, predictably, erupted because this was supposed to be impossible. He survived twice before. Twice, Senate Republicans locked arms and acquitted. Twice, he walked away declaring total vindication. This time, that wall cracked, and it didn't crack quietly. The evidence was heavier. The constitutional violations were more blatant. The political pressure, intense. Enough Republican senators looked at what unfolded and decided they could not defend it anymore. Behind closed doors, by multiple accounts, he's furious, calling the vote illegitimate, calling it a coup, insisting he's still president regardless of what the Senate says. But the Constitution doesn't offer appeals for impeachment convictions. There's no Supreme Court review, no redo, 2/3 voted to convict. That's the mechanism. That's the end of it. J.D. Vance is preparing to take the oath, and the country is stepping into terrain we've never mapped before. So how did we get here? Because this didn't happen overnight. It began with Venezuela, a military operation launched without congressional approval, no authorization, no constitutional cover, just a unilateral decision to act, and it went badly. Civilian casualties, international condemnation, allies openly questioning whether the United States could be trusted, and members of Congress on both sides were furious that they had been bypassed entirely. Hearings followed. Generals testified that warnings were ignored. Former administration officials described a president who treated congressional authorization as optional. Even his own chief of staff's admissions about weaponized prosecutions and fabricated scandals became central to the case. What made the testimony devastating wasn't partisan rhetoric. It was the source. Republicans, former loyalists, people who had stood by him before, sitting under oath and describing conduct that suggested a president operating above the law. The House voted to impeach, abuse of power, violation of war powers, obstruction of Congress. A handful of Republicans joined Democrats, not many, but enough to show movement. Then the articles went to the Senate, and that's where the tension sharpened. Republican senators found themselves squeezed between two forces that were pulling in opposite directions. On one side, sworn testimony, televised evidence, a military operation gone wrong, constitutional lines clearly crossed. On the other, a voter base fiercely loyal to Trump, ready to punish anyone who broke ranks. Some senators locked in immediately. No evidence would sway them. Their calculation was simple: loyalty first. But 18 did something different. Some were institutionalists. They believed in congressional war powers and couldn't reconcile a president who ignored them. Some represented competitive states where swing voters were alarmed by what they'd seen. Others were retiring, free, at least electorally, to vote their conscience. And as the trial unfolded, something shifted. One Republican announced he would vote to convict, then another, then several more. Momentum is a powerful thing in Washington. It's easier to be the fifth person to step forward than the first. What looked immovable began to fracture. When the clerk called the roll, names followed one after another. Democrats unified, and then Republican voices interspersed, breaking ranks publicly. 68 votes to convict, 18 Republicans joined 50 Democrats. History. Now pause there, because before we even talk about the consequences, it's worth recognizing what that number represents. Careers on the line, party lines crossed, political calculations rewritten in real time, and none of it theoretical anymore. The moment that gavel came down, everything changed immediately. Not in 10 days, not after a transition period, immediately. Donald Trump was no longer president. Classified briefings stopped. Authority over the nuclear codes transferred. The machinery of the executive branch moved on without him. J.D. Vance prepared to assume the office. The presidency doesn't pause for emotion. And that's one of the hardest parts of this to process. Power in America is institutional. It belongs to the office, not the person. When 2/3 of the Senate votes to convict, the office moves forward. There's no appeal, no constitutional loophole, no second bite at the apple. But removal is only the first layer. The Senate can hold another vote, this one requiring only a simple majority to bar him from ever holding federal office again. That's a different threshold, a different calculation. If that vote succeeds, it doesn't just end a term, it ends the possibility of a comeback. No 2028, no campaign rallies promising restoration, no one more time. And then there are the legal realities. Department of Justice policy shields a sitting president from prosecution. Once that protection disappears, investigations that were paused can move. Cases that were deferred can proceed. The January 6th matters. The classified documents, Georgia, any other inquiries quietly advancing in the background. As a private citizen, he would face them without the leverage of the presidency. That shift alone would be destabilizing. But politically, the shockwave runs even wider. 18 Republican senators voted to remove him. That's not a fringe rebellion. That's a substantial portion of the conference publicly severing ties. The party now faces a split that can't be papered over with talking points. On one side, those who remained loyal to the end. On the other, those who said the line had finally been crossed. That kind of fracture doesn't heal quickly, it lingers. It reshapes leadership races, committee assignments, donor networks. It becomes personal. And then there's 2028. If he's barred from office, the Republican primary becomes an open contest overnight. Candidates who stayed in his shadow, careful not to provoke him, suddenly have space. Ambition that was suppressed begins to surface. The coalition that once revolved around one personality has to reorganize itself around ideas or factions or geography. For Democrats, the equation changes too. For years, campaigns were framed around opposition to him, his conduct, his style, his controversies. Remove that central figure, and the strategic map shifts. Opponents without his baggage may also lack his polarizing effect. Uncertainty replaces predictability. But here is the piece that makes all of this feel fragile. He is not accepting the verdict. Publicly, he's calling it illegitimate, a coup, insisting he remains president regardless of the vote, and a significant number of his supporters believe that claim. Social media has filled with calls for protest. Some messages are heated. Some cross into something darker. So we have to ask questions that, until now, felt theoretical. What happens if a removed president refuses to leave? What if he physically remains in the White House and declares the process invalid? What if supporters attempt to interfere with the transfer of power? The Constitution is clear on paper. Conviction by two-thirds means removal, full stop. But constitutions rely on compliance. If compliance falters, who acts? The Secret Service? The military? Federal law enforcement? Who does each institution recognize as commander-in-chief at that precise moment? These aren't classroom hypotheticals anymore. They're operational questions. And the unsettling truth is that we've never had to answer them in real time. There's a difference between reading about constitutional mechanisms and watching them activate under stress, between debating war powers in theory and seeing testimony about civilians harmed because authorization was bypassed. The system functioned. A president was held accountable through the impeachment process exactly as designed, but it required extraordinary conditions, and unauthorized military action, damaging testimony from insiders, public pressure intense enough to shift political incentives, senators willing to risk their careers. That's not a casual safeguard. That's a mechanism that activates under extreme strain, which leaves us in a complicated place. The rule of law asserted itself. And yet, the very fact that we reached this point reveals how close to the edge the system had drifted. Now the country faces the aftermath. A former president rejecting removal, a political party recalibrating in real time, institutions bracing for potential unrest, voters trying to make sense of what just occurred. He spent years insisting this outcome could never happen. That impeachment was illegitimate. That conviction was impossible. And then 68 names were read aloud, just like that. Everything he built, politically, institutionally, personally, shifted in the span of a roll call. Power, platform, immunity, identity, gone the moment the Senate crossed that two-thirds threshold. And here's what makes this even more disorienting. Just months before that vote, the focus wasn't on removal. It was on the midterms, on maintaining control of Congress at all costs, because control of Congress meant insulation. He had been clear about that. If Republicans lost the House and Senate, he believed impeachment would follow. That fear-shaped strategy, it shaped messaging. It shaped the push to influence how elections themselves are administered. In the nation's capital, the House passed the Save America Act, a sweeping election bill championed by him. The vote was tight, 218 to 213. Nearly every Democrat opposed it. If enacted, it would require proof of citizenship to register to vote. Supporters framed it as protection. Critics saw it as restriction. The speaker argued that anyone opposing the bill must want to undermine democracy, to cheat the system. That was the language. But the bill's path in the Senate was uncertain. It faced the 60-vote threshold. Bipartisan support would have been necessary. And after everything that unfolded, the impeachment, the trial, the fractures within the Republican conference, that kind of unity was far from guaranteed. It's striking, isn't it? On one track, a push to tighten election rules. On another, an impeachment trial culminating in removal. Two storylines converging around the same anxiety: control of Congress, control of narrative, control of legacy. But institutions don't revolve around any one individual. They are designed, sometimes imperfectly, to outlast personalities. Still, design only matters if people respect it. He has called the conviction illegitimate, a coup, an attack. And when a leader labels constitutional outcomes as unlawful, that language travels, it amplifies, it settles into corners of the electorate already primed to distrust the system. That's where the real tension lives now, not in the text of the Constitution, not in the vote count, but in whether enough people accept the outcome as binding. Because if acceptance fractures, the consequences ripple outward: protests, counter-protests, political retaliation, primary challenges, legislative gridlock. The Republican Party must decide what it is without him at the center. The Democratic Party must recalibrate its message in a landscape no longer defined by his daily presence. Voters, meanwhile, are left to reconcile two realities: a constitutional process that worked and a political culture strained to its limits. And I keep thinking about something simple. The framers built impeachment as a last resort, a mechanism for moments when power is abused so clearly that removal becomes unavoidable. It was never meant to be routine, it was meant to be stabilizing. But stabilization requires trust. Trust that evidence matters. Trust that oaths matter. Trust that when a verdict is rendered, even painful ones, the nation moves forward. We are now testing that trust in real time. He is panicking because the unthinkable happened. The Senate convicted, the presidency transferred, the shield of office dissolved. But the broader question isn't about him anymore. It's about whether the country can absorb this shock without tearing itself apart. History just turned a page. And once a page turns, you don't get to slide it back into place and pretend it never moved.